When the roll-on, roll-off ferry named the Anvil Point was launched from Belfast Holland & Wolff shipyard on the 22nd of March 2003, it was hardly an earth-shattering event. This snub-nosed car ferry was one of 6 near-identical vessels built for the UK's Ministry of Defence. Despite the champagne send-off, the ceremony was as unremarkable as the ship itself.
Nevertheless, the Anvil Point was assured a place in history, but for one simple reason. It was the last complete vessel to be built in what was once the greatest shipyard in the world. At that time, it seemed 150 years of shipbuilding would end not with a bang, but with a whimper.
The once mighty shipbuilders had reached an all-time low, but they survived, just as they'd done many times before. In fact, their entire history is a tale of triumph over adversity, on a global scale. When the Europe of old was disintegrating, the ships they built brought young blood to the new world. They played a part in the shaping of the fortunes of whole empires and the outcome of 2 world wars. They also gave the world its single most celebrated ship, even if that fame came at a terrible price.
Although she is by far the most famous, the Titanic was just one of nearly 2,000 ships built by Holland & Wolff during the company's history. In fact, remarkable as it may seem, the shipyards of Belfast once produced no less than 1/8 of the world's total shipping output. The story of how that came to be is a saga on a scale as grand as the Titanic itself.
Before the advent of the airplane, it was command of the oceans that determined the shapes of empires. The true measure of a nation's greatness was in the strength of its ships, and Victorian Britain was no exception. In the mid-1800s, steam and iron were about to revolutionise shipbuilding. As for the centre of excellence that would power this revolution, Belfast must have seemed an unlikely candidate. Only the most fervent optimist would have predicted the success that lay ahead. Ireland was a latecomer to the so-called Second Industrial Revolution of the late 19th century. The country was still reeling from the devastation of the famine, less than 2 decades earlier, with 1 million dead from starvation and disease, and a further 1 million lost through emigration.
Although it escaped the worst of the ravages of the Great Hunger itself, there was a large influx of famine victims from rural areas, desperate for work. Already one of Ireland's busiest ports, Belfast was one of the fastest growing population centres in the United Kingdom in the 19th century. Like some burgeoning boomtown on the American frontier, the deal in Belfast was simple. You didn't work, you starved.
Cotton and linen were the main industries, while the production of factory machinery produced only light engineering work. Tobacco had been an important employer even before the arrival of Gallagher's factory in 1863. But the demand for work generally outstripped the supply, and with no welfare state, the capital was a pitiless place to be unemployed. Grinding poverty was evident throughout the city. Its slums were amongst the worst in Europe, and Belfast claimed the highest mortality rate of any city in the British Isles. Here, as in many cities throughout Britain, this impoverished underclass became an essential raw material, fueling the surge in technology and industry that became the hallmark of the Victorian era.
Whilst the British Empire undoubtedly led the Second Industrial Revolution, others, including France, the Low Countries and Germany, were catching up fast.
The new technologies of steam railways, electricity and the telegraph were driving an economic boom for the elite who controlled them. But for the labour class, drawn from their life in the fields to the choking urban factories, disease, hardship and squalor simply came with the job. Back in Northern Ireland, the industrial age was kick-started when the Belfast Harbour Commissioners cut a channel across one of the River Lagan's curves. This created a new piece of land called Queen's Island, offering more room and greater potential to shipbuilders. When a promising young Yorkshire engineer called Edward James Harland arrived to take up the position of shipyard manager, the 23-year-old was already a hard taskmaster.
Harland's tender years hardly endeared him to the workforce, nor did the higher standards, lower wages and a smoking ban, which he implemented shortly after arriving there. He'd walk through the yard chalk in hand, marking off inferior workmanship. This drive for perfection fueled his unpopularity, almost to the point of a walkout.
But Harland's firebrand leadership ultimately won him the respect of his workforce, and soon he was offered the chance to buy the company for £5,000. To raise the necessary finances, Harland turned to a wealthy shipping financier he had met during his apprenticeship. Gustavus Christian Schwab isn't exactly a household name, yet he played an instrumental role in the early success of the world's greatest shipyard. It was his backing that allowed Harland to accept the offer and make the shipyard his own. It was Schwab that provided this new company with its first 3 orders. And it was Schwab's nephew, Gustav Wilhelm Wolff, who had been Harland's loyal assistant throughout the recent near mutiny at the yard. When the young assistant was made partner in 1861, an historical alliance between German efficiency and British technology was forged. Harland and Wolff was born. Almost immediately, they began developing radical new ship designs. Squarer hulls accommodated larger loads. Steel decks rather than wood made for a much stronger structure. And a greater length to width ratio increased their ship's speed and efficiency and gave them a sleeker look. All this brought business success and greater employment. But it would be wrong to suggest it was all plain sailing.
As early as 1868, just a year after the firm had officially become Harland and Wolff, the partners already had racked up losses of £16,000. And to make matters worse, they had to complete at their own expense the as yet unnamed ship number 44. Again, Schwab came to the rescue. By finding a buyer for the ship, he set in motion a historic partnership that would have repercussions well into the next century.
The new buyer was Thomas Henry Ismay, a young Liverpool shipowner who had recently purchased, yet again with Schwab's help, a small bankrupt shipping company for the grand sum of £1,000. Ismay desperately needed more passenger ships for his fledgling business, while Harland and Wolff ship number 44 was up for grabs. So the ever-generous Schwab coughed up a quarter of the finance to help Ismay acquire the vessel for his new shipping company.
And the name of the company was the White Star Line.
Together, these two companies were set to become the greatest suppliers of shipping in the world. And the demand to meet that supply was already well established. With the American Civil War behind it, the United States was booming. The shipping giant Cunard had introduced the first transatlantic passenger service in 1840, and in the half-century since, the population of the US had quadrupled. Immigrants poured in, mainly from Europe, including the hundreds of thousands of Irish who had fled the famine. There was even a sustained demand for the return journey, since many who arrived soon found the former colony fell short of their expectations. During these same 5 decades, an estimated 100,000 immigrants returned to their European homes despite the poverty and disease that had driven them away in the first place. As a direct result of this burgeoning migration, ships were growing larger and faster. Cunard was the biggest name in shipping at the time, but they provided a mainly first-class service for the wealthy. The bulk of the new demand came from the huge numbers of working class or steerage passengers. So, the new partnership of Holland and Wolff and the White Star Line began gearing itself up to break into this highly lucrative market. It was over an after-dinner game of billiards at Schwab's Liverpool home that Wolff, the shipbuilder, and Ismay, the ship owner, forged their historical alliance. The business arrangement was straightforward enough. Ismay would agree to have all his ships built by Holland and Wolff on a cost plus percentage basis. And in return, the yard would not build for any of White Star's rivals. Schwab would mobilise the finances, and no complex legal contracts would be required. Just a simple letter of agreement for each ship signed by both parties. It was effectively a declaration of war on Cunard and the other transatlantic rivals, including those of Germany and America. The stakes were enormous, and to the victor would go the spoils. So began the rivalry between the two companies that would last well into the next century, producing ever bigger and more luxurious liners. As Holland and Wolff's workforce swelled to meet the new demand, political tension began to set in. This was a time when the Home Rule movement was gathering momentum, with nationalists seeking to break the union with Great Britain and restore internal government to Ireland. At the shipyard, there was widespread discrimination and even violence against Catholics. It was the Protestant workers who traditionally had the required skills and education. And since apprentices were usually spoken for by personal recommendation, the workforce stayed overwhelmingly Protestant. As future Unionist MPs, neither Holland nor Wolff did much to discourage the sectarianism that naturally followed. But none of this affected the quality of their work. The pioneer vessel and pride of the White Star Line was the 420-foot Oceanic, which caused a sensation on the 16th of March 1871 when she first arrived in New York, greeted by 50,000 well-wishers. In a taste of much greater things to come, a large part of her celebrity was due to the sheer level of luxury she offered her most valued passengers.
For the very first time, the ocean-going aristocracy had their own individual dining room chairs as opposed to the long benches of the Oceanic's predecessors. And they sat in opulent dining saloons and cabins, centrally located on the ship to keep engine noise and vibration to a minimum. Within a decade, the opulence of first-class quarters was on par with the top hotels of Europe.
Competition for the transatlantic market was cutthroat, and the resulting ships evolved at breakneck speed. In less than 20 years, passenger ships more than quadrupled in size, gaining speed and power with each new launch. Before the century was out, the world had seen the launch of the White Star's Oceanic II at a record-breaking 17,250 tons. Quite simply, it was an arms race, one that would eventually lead to disaster. While this ferocious commercial war raged between White Star, Cunard, and several smaller companies, a similar rivalry was emerging among the many powers in Europe. Britain was undisputedly the richest and most powerful amongst a handful of empires across the world. Its naval fleet was at least twice the size of its nearest rivals, France and Germany, combined. Its rule extended over 1/4 of the Earth's surface and governed 1/3 of the people living at the time. But a newly established German empire had seen some 30 or so disparate independent states united under the Prussian Prime Minister, Otto von Bismarck, the Iron Chancellor of Germany. He engineered wars against Denmark, Austria and France in pursuit of his life's dream of a unified Germany, and then set about building alliances throughout Europe to protect it from the threat of retribution. Germany held close ties with the still powerful Austro-Hungarian Empire. Britain, despite its splendid isolation, would forge a military agreement with Japan and was loosely allied to France, which was bound by treaty to Russia. Russia was sympathetic to Serbia, who in turn was at odds with Austro-Hungary, while Italy was caught somewhere in the middle. The sheer complexity of this tangled political web made its eventual collapse almost inevitable.
This tangle of treaties and alliances left Europe and increasingly parts of Africa and Asia unstable, with a powerful yet isolated Germany at the heart. It certainly contributed to the attraction of a new life in America and added to Europe's flow of poor across the Atlantic.
"Bring me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses," implored the Statue of Liberty as she stared back towards the old world, and wave after wave of immigrants answered her call. The shipping companies fought desperately to accommodate this huge market, drastically cutting their fares in the process, and one American in particular began to smell an opportunity. John Pierpont Morgan was a man of physically intimidating stature, with piercing, no-nonsense eyes, but a hatred of being photographed due to his bulbous purple nose. This aversion to publicity, however, didn't prevent him from becoming one of the most powerful financiers in US history. Here's a man so ludicrously wealthy that when the US Federal Treasury almost ran out of gold in the so-called Panic of 1893, the president asked him for a loan of $65 million. To say that he had an eye for a business opportunity would be a bit of an understatement. When Morgan turned his attention to transatlantic shipping, he entered the race with a typically ferocious business approach. He had no intention of bothering with anything so trifling as fare cutting. Instead, he would simply buy up all the transatlantic shipping companies. Then he could charge what he liked. Morgan established a shipping superpower called International Mercantile Marine, or IMM. He snapped up every available passenger line he could buy, both in Europe and America. But what he really needed was one of the two big British companies. When he attempted to buy Cunard, Morgan was thwarted by the financial intervention of the British government, keen to avoid losing such a lucrative enterprise to an American. White Star were equally opposed to the advances of the encroaching mogul, with the aging Thomas Henry Ismay leading the opposition. It seemed Morgan could go no further in his plans to conquer British shipping. But when Ismay died in 1899, he left the White Star Line in the hands of his relatively inexperienced son, Joseph Bruce Ismay. This was good news for J.P. Morgan. Ismay Jr. put up much less of a fight than his father, and as it turned out, he wasn't the only one who was open to doing business with the American tycoon.
Morgan already had a firm ally at Holland and Wolfe, one of the most colourful characters to emerge from the whole saga, and who would become probably the most powerful Ulsterman in history.
William James Pirrie was born in Quebec in 1847 of Ulster Scots heritage. When his family returned to Northern Ireland, he joined Holland and Wolfe as a gentleman apprentice at just 15 years old. Such was his ambition and drive that within 12 years, he was made a partner of the company. When the shipyard's founder, Sir Edward Holland, died in 1885, Pirrie became chief executive, and later, when Wolfe retired, chairman, a role he would hold for the rest of his life.
But he was also a visionary designer who for almost half a century pioneered just about every significant development in maritime engineering, but most importantly, he was also an extremely shrewd businessman.
As head of a shipbuilding company, it was really none of Pirrie's business who controlled the passenger routes to America, but he knew that having a billionaire tycoon on board could only be good for business. If Cunard and the British government didn't want to get into bed with J.P. Morgan, that was their loss. Pirrie acted as matchmaker between Morgan on the one hand and the young J. Bruce Ismay on the other. The relationship flourished into a marriage of convenience between American finances and British engineering. With a dowry of $10 million, Morgan's IMM bought the White Star Line, keeping Ismay on as chief executive. But there were three people in this marriage, since Pirrie also joined the board of IMM, giving him a unique position of power as both shipbuilder and shipowner.
As the 20th century began, these three men had become the most powerful and influential in the history of shipping, and already at least one of them was planning to build the biggest ocean liners the world had ever seen. But he wasn't alone, because bigger and better ships were about to become the very essence of contemporary military thinking.
Following the dismissal of Bismarck, Germany's military and naval affairs were now being overseen by Kaiser Wilhelm II, who made no secret of his ambitions to make Germany a world power. Wilhelm had always been hugely impressed by British shipping. When he had seen the White Star's Teutonic during a visit with his uncle, the Prince of Wales, he openly declared, "We must have some of these." Fearing conflict on two fronts, with France and Russia, he began stepping up Germany's military strength, including his pet project of building a navy powerful enough to rival Britain's.
The Royal Navy's response was typically arms race. They would simply go one better. In 1906, they unveiled their secret weapon, an entirely new class of warship, so advanced that the moment it hit the water, it made every other battleship in the world obsolete.
Built in record time to preserve her secrecy, HMS Dreadnought was the sixth in the Royal Navy to carry that name, but in almost every other way, she was an original. The first of many to be built to the specification of the eccentric and flamboyant Admiral of the Fleet, Lord Fisher. She heralded a new class of British warship, typical of his vision of what a battleship should be. Big, fast, and heavily armed. This was the first warship to be powered by steam turbines. At her launch, a top speed of over 20 knots made her the fastest large battleship in the world. She was also the first to carry a uniform battery of large guns, 5 twin turrets of 2 12-inch guns each, thus greatly simplifying the firing process in battle. As a result, she could outrun any vessel with comparable guns and outgun any smaller ships that might be faster. As long as she stayed beyond the range of an enemy's secondary guns, she would have the military advantage.
The whole point of this innovation was to send a clear message to Germany and to other nations not to mess with the Royal Navy. But this was an arms race, and the results were painfully predictable. Soon, dreadnought-style ships appeared in all the major navies of the world. And before long, Belfast was to have her first taste of the oversized guns and turbine engines that powered these dreadnoughts in the form of HMS Glorious, destined to become Holland and Wolff's first ever battle cruiser.
But for now, the shipbuilders were still preoccupied with the more benign, though no less ferocious peacetime battle for the Atlantic. Holland and Wolff's partnership with the White Star Line now had the financial power of J.P. Morgan behind it. But their rivals Cunard had just won a major victory in this ongoing commercial war. In their attempts to keep Morgan out of the picture, the British government had bolstered Cunard's position with cheap loans and subsidies. This led to the creation of two giant ocean liners, the Lusitania and the Mauretania, the fastest and most luxurious Cunard would ever build. Where White Star's main concern was passenger comfort, their rivals now placed more emphasis on speed. The 25-knot Mauretania had captured the much-coveted, though unofficial, blue-ribboned award for the fastest Atlantic crossing. An honour it would keep for more than 20 years.
To White Star, this would have been a total PR disaster, except even before the maiden voyage of either of their rivals' flagships, Perry had conceived something much grander still.
One summer evening in 1907, the increasingly ambitious shipbuilder and his wife Margaret invited J. Bruce Ismay and his wife Florence to their Mayfair residence in London. After dinner, Perry revealed his great plan. They would build 3 giant transatlantic superliners, more massive and opulent by far than anything yet seen.
They began sketching Perry's dream. Floating palaces, each larger than the last, each one holding in turn the title, the world's finest ship, and the largest, designed to be nothing less than the greatest achievement of the era that would be called the Gilded Age. And their names would reflect their immense stature, the Olympic, the Titanic, and the Gigantic.
So much has been written and spoken about the Titanic that it's easy to overlook the skill, ambition, and sheer audacity of the 3 sister ships taken as a whole. The technical drawings alone took over a year to complete. Then, before any actual shipbuilding could begin, they first had to call in the same construction company that had built the 4th bridge in Scotland to construct the 6,000-ton Arrol gantry, also the largest in the world, and tall enough to accommodate St. Paul's Cathedral. The shipyard already had the world's largest dry dock, but ultimately even that had to be extended to accommodate the Olympic-class liners.
It was the same story in New York, a bit like today's airports, struggling to accommodate the world's largest passenger airliners. The New York City piers simply weren't big enough to accept the Olympic superliners. White Star's request to have the piers extended was flatly refused. The New York Port Authority said it would be a hazard to navigation on the Hudson. Only when the mighty J.P. Morgan, and he virtually owned the New York docks and could have brought the import-export business to a grinding halt, only when he stepped in was the decision reversed and the pier capacity enlarged.
Morgan himself visited Belfast to keep an eye on his investment, inspecting the plans and checking details even down to the furniture that would be used. Of course, he held a personal interest in the Titanic in particular, since he would have the finest suite of all on B-deck, complete with its own promenade and many more subtle luxuries, such as cigar holders in the bathroom. In a time before arc welding, the three ships combined would require a total of nearly 1 billion iron rivets, more than 3,500 tons of them. To pull a wagon carrying just one of the 15-ton anchors to the shipyard required 20 strong horses.
Thousands of workers laboured for 3 years just to get the first 2 empty hulls afloat, to ease the 26,000-ton shells down these very slipways required 23 tons of tallow, soap and grease, much of which was then gathered up by the workers and taken home as a source of cheap toiletry. Once afloat, the fitting out process almost doubled their weight and took nearly a year for each ship.
This would have included the installation of the swimming pool and Turkish baths, crystal chandeliers and candelabras, the 50-line telephone exchange, 200 miles of electric wiring, which fed, amongst other things, the 4 elevators, 10,000 light bulbs, and even the electric camel in the gymnasium. In contrast to the popular image, even steerage passengers were to enjoy greater comfort than ever before. Most would sleep in 2-berth cabins rather than a shared dormitory. For some in third class, the food they ate aboard the Titanic would be the best they ever tasted. Even if for many, it would also be the last. Overseeing all of this, of course, was the brilliant young Belfast engineer and designer, Thomas Andrews. As Perry's nephew, nepotism probably did play a part in his appointment, but his swift rise through Holland and Wolff was entirely his own achievement. Like any other young apprentice, his parents would have paid the £100 fee for him to join, and he soon distinguished himself in just about every department. It was sheer hard work, technical genius, and downright likability which earned him the respect of both his men and his peers. The 35-year-old proudly took up office as Holland Wolff's managing director in 1907, just in time to start work on the world's biggest ships. As the Olympic neared completion, she was soon joined on the slipways by the Titanic, an extraordinary testament to this young man's meteoric success.
On a clear night in 1910, just weeks ahead of the birth of his daughter Elizabeth, Thomas Andrews brought his pregnant wife Helen here to the shipyard to see the ship under construction. They came at night so that she could see Halley's Comet, which was clearly visible in the night sky. Little did he know the terrible irony that the next time Halley's Comet would appear, in 1986, would be 1 year after the wreck of the Titanic had been discovered 2.5 miles down on the floor of the Atlantic Ocean, and where Thomas Andrews' remains still lie.
As news of the Titanic's horrific collision with the iceberg trickled back to Belfast, it was met with disbelief by the men who had toiled for years to build her. Grown men, hardened by years of back-breaking labour, wept openly as the realisation set in. Their ship of dreams was gone. Among the dead was the ship's designer, their friend, Thomas Andrews, last witness sitting silently, head in hands, as the final moments of his magnificent creation approached. Also lost was the ship's captain, Edward Smith, who, as tradition would have it, went down with his ship. Perry and Morgan never made it aboard due to ill health, and so were spared, while Ismay escaped in one of the lifeboats, only to be branded a coward and forced to resign in disgrace. Most on board, however, shared no such good fortune. 1,513 men, women and children were lost, more than 2/3 of those on board. The optimism that fueled a revolution in ship design sank along with the Titanic, and on the eve of the bloodiest conflict in history, the age of the Victorian giants was over. The SS Nomadic is now the last White Star Line vessel left in the world. Originally built to ferry passengers between the shallow port at Cherbourg and the 3 Olympic-class ships, she only ever pulled up alongside the Titanic once. It's almost a century since the Titanic was lost, and much of her story has been obscured in a fog of rumours, myths and conspiracy theories. Included amongst these is the swapping of the Olympic and Titanic's identities as part of an elaborate insurance scam, though there is little evidence to support it.
We do know the Titanic's crew received a total of 21 telegraphed ice warnings in the 4 days before she struck the iceberg, but that would have been entirely expected in the waters off Newfoundland at that time of year, so of course the warnings were ignored.
The popular notion that Ismay and Captain Smith colluded in a frantic race to set a new speed record is certainly not true. As was well established at the subsequent inquiries, the ship wasn't sailing at full speed, and not all her boilers were lit. Titanic was built for comfort and fuel economy, not for speed, and arriving early in New York would only have inconvenienced her passengers. Of course, it's well documented that there simply weren't enough lifeboats to go round, even though the ship fell well within the Board of Trade regulations, which called for a mere 16. In fact, the Titanic's original design had specified in excess of 60 lifeboats, more than enough for everyone on board. But the number was whittled down to just 20, purely for aesthetic reasons.
But hindsight is a wonderful thing. It's now widely believed that had the Titanic been making only slightly less speed, or even had she not tried to turn away and steer out of the situation and struck bow on, she would have survived. Perhaps the greatest tragedy then is it all so easily could have been avoided.
And perhaps that's why the story of the Titanic still resonates so profoundly today. This was no ordinary maiden voyage. For many, it was a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to escape the oppression and injustice of the old class system in Europe. Who can say what a difference those 1,500 lost people, full of aspirations and dreams of a new life in America, would have made to the world had their journey continued without incident.
As for the Titanic, had she survived, it's almost certain she would have suffered her sister's fate, stripped of her finery and conscripted into the conflict that would soon follow, the first in history to be called a world war.